Hello everyone, Jay Warden here, and welcome to my recap and review of the episode Hiding Q, where Q offers Riker an incredible gift but spends far too long getting to the point and then wastes the opportunity. Remember those spoilers, and otherwise, enjoy. The Enterprise is rushing to a mining outpost which had a big accident, so everyone is getting ready to help them when suddenly they're jumped by the Eye of Sauron, and throws the now familiar Tron grid in their face, forcing Picard to slam on the brakes. It looks like Q has decided to pay the crew another visit, and says that after their Farpoint mission, the Q decided that maybe humanity aren't a bunch of dicks after all, and that they may be worthy of some further inspection, so he has a fantastic offer for them. Picard and Riker are just pissed off though, because some humans are suffering and dying, and Q retorts that humans are always doing that kind of shit anyway, and that what he wants to talk about is far more important. Worf is just itching to get his ass kicked, but Picard denies him the pleasure, and then Q goes out of his way to rub it in Worf's face. Picard tells Q that he's prepared to listen to his proposal after they complete their rescue mission, before complaining how Q is always being such a dick to them. Q isn't impressed and berates Picard for his closed mind before turning to Riker and wondering how he feels about his offer. Riker is with Picard on this though and tells Q they've got no time for these silly games, but this seems to give Q an idea and excitedly transports everyone but Picard off the bridge. It looks like he whisks them away to some unknown planet which looks a lot more like a studio set with a fuck ugly green background. They wonder where they are, but Data points out that considering the powers Q demonstrated last time, it could literally be anywhere or nowhere. As they start to have a look around, they find Q all dressed up again, sitting in a Napoleonic looking tent. He invites them over for a chat and some refreshments, though I do wonder what Data could possibly find refreshing as a drink. As Riker enjoys his lemonade, he asks what the fuck this is all about. Q explains that they're interested in the human need for change and want to understand this compulsion better, and he thinks having a game or two to see if any of them can stay alive is a good way to go about understanding this. Worf says as long as the game's fair, of course they'll win, but Q says that's hardly sporting, so it will instead be completely unfair. Yar gets a bit upset about this, but Q doesn't have time for her shit, so sends her to something called a penalty box where unfortunately only one person at a time can fit inside. On the Enterprise, Picard is all on his own, trapped on the bridge as nothing seems to work, and lamenting that he can't even make a simple log entry, when Yar shows up and tries to explain what Q's up to. But then she breaks down and starts to cry because she might end up dead, so Picard tries to give her some moral support. It seems to do the trick because then she tries to seduce him. Okay? Q though thankfully interrupts this bizarre seduction attempt and says the penalty is over and that she'll be alright now. Picard demands to know what Q's really up to this time, and he reveals he's actually testing Riker to see if he's worthy of the greatest gift he can imagine. Picard thinks Riker already has this in the bag, but Q seems confident enough to suggest a wager, saying if he wins, Picard will lose his command, but if Riker wins, Q needs to promise to fuck off and never interfere with them again. He gleefully accepts and the game is on. Picard though still wants to know more and asks if the Q are so interested in humans, why can't they just be polite about it and ask what they want instead of just being dicks all the time. Q is evasive and thinking he's smart starts quoting Shakespeare at him, but he's made a mistake here because Picard loves a good bit of Shakespeare and he knows that shit like the back of his hand, so quotes some Hamlet back to him. Q knows he doesn't have a witty retort to this, so ends up vanishing angrily. Meanwhile, on the obvious studio set, we quickly check in on Riker and company. They're observing what seems to be a camp of Napoleonic soldiers, but a close-up reveals they're not all they seem to be, wearing some god-awful makeup and making pig noises. It looks like this is just a straight up boring game of kill or be killed, and because it seems like they're using muskets, Data and LaForge think this will be an easy game because when it comes to muskets versus phasers, there really is no competition. Riker though isn't convinced and knows it's not like Q to just make it so easy, so tests his phaser out quickly just to make sure Q didn't mess with him. It seems to work just fine, so Riker asks Data if he has any more theories, but instead Data has turned into Q and tells him to think fast as the soldiers get close and start firing. It seems those simple muskets are actually powerful energy weapons, making things a little bit more even, so Riker quickly returns fire and vaporizes a couple of them. But more keep coming and Q says he's only got one chance to save them now, which is to use his power. Riker's confused by what this means, so Q has to spell it out for him and says he's literally been given the power of the Q, and to use it to save the rest of his crew before vanishing. As the soldiers keep closing on them, Riker looks at his hand and waves it hilariously, causing everyone to vanish back to the ship. Back on board, control has been restored and the crew have all been returned to the bridge except for Riker. They quickly brief Picard on what happened, but Data wants to leave out the gory details because Picard might be a bit squeamish. Picard updates them about Q testing Riker this time, but there's nothing they can really do about it right now, so must focus on continuing their original rescue mission. Back on the fuck ugly planet set, Riker does his best fake laughter impression and lets Q know he's just a joke before asking what it is he really wants from them. Q for once drops his usual persona and explains a little bit about where he lives, called the Q Continuum. He speaks seriously about their concerns about how humanity will evolve over the next few eons, and they desperately want to understand why humans are the way they are, and they seem to hope by having Riker join the Q Continuum, they can better understand what makes humans tick. Riker remains suspicious though, and on top of that still thinks Q's a dick, so Q decides to force the situation a little and brings everyone, including Picard and Wesley this time, back to the planet. However, he's now taken their phasers away from them, leaving them completely defenseless from the approaching soldiers. So Worf does what Worf does best, charges in and gets his ass kicked before getting stabbed to death. Wesley runs over to try and help him, but also gets stabbed and killed, and some of us might be briefly celebrating this fact. However, with his crewmates dying before his eyes, Riker gets angry and uses his newfound powers to transport everyone back to the ship, healing Worf and Wesley in the process. As everyone stares in shock at what just happened, Riker just stands there looking smug as fuck, and why not when you've literally just become a god? As the Enterprise finally approaches the stricken mining outpost, Picard has a quick chat with Riker about his newfound godhood. He says humans aren't ready for this kind of shit and makes him promise not to use his powers because that's just not playing fair, and it might lead to Riker becoming a dick like Q, and nobody wants that. Riker says that would never happen and thinks he can easily resist the temptation to use his powers, and happily agrees to the promise. So he gets on with his business and beams down to the planet to perform their rescue operations. They discover a few survivors, but tragically find a young girl buried amongst the rubble who died of her injuries before they could get there. Riker knows he could use his new powers to save her, but keeps his promise all the same, making him rather angry that he made it in the first place. Once he returns to the ship, he expresses regret at making that promise and then starts being a dick by demanding a conference with the crew and then just walks off the bridge. Moments later though, he just walks straight back on, and fuck knows where he went during that interlude. But all the crew are gathered now, including Wesley for some reason, and he tries to reassure them that, honestly, I'm not turning into a twat just because I have godlike powers for all of 10 minutes, even though he's clearly started acting like an all-powerful twat. Picard tries to point this out to him, but Riker isn't seeing it and asks why would it have been wrong to save the young girl any more than when he used his power to save them from the planet earlier. As they have a back and forth about what these powers are doing to him and if the Q really admire or just fear humans, Q arrives in yet another silly costume pretending to be a Christian monk and starts doing his usual nonsense. Picard tries to use this as an example of why having such enormous power might turn you into a twat, and then it turns into a battle of will between Picard and Q. Did you see what I did there? You know, battle of will, it's a pun on. Q suggests that Riker show his love for his crew by giving them all a gift, and Picard says go for it because he reckons he knows how this will turn out. Riker tells everyone not to be scared, so Dr. Beverly immediately tries to drag Wesley off the bridge because she's shit scared, and Wesley really shouldn't have been there in the first place. Riker stops him though and thinks he knows what Wesley might want best of all, so turns him into a hunk of a man, 10 years older but with a teenage voice still. He then tries to make Data human, but Data would much rather keep his superior strength and reasoning, so turns him down. He tries his luck on LaForge next by giving him some real working eyes. LaForge takes a moment to enjoy looking at the world as everyone else does, as well as finally getting his wish at perving on what a pretty girl might look like before saying, nope, I'd rather be in constant pain and have the ability to see through walls, so gets Riker to make him blind again. Realising it's not going so well anymore, he tries one more time with Worf, and it seems all Worf wants from life is to have a willing sex slave he can get rough with, but even Worf thinks this isn't a good idea right now and refuses. Picard looks on smugly, and Riker realises that, as predicted, he's indeed being a twat now, and feels like an idiot for giving into it, even though I can't quite figure out why his mates refusing awesome gifts makes him realise this. With victory in sight, Picard goes up to Q and tells him to pay up his wager and fuck off. Q is indignant and says there was no wager, but it seems his fellow Q are upset with him in his failure to turn Riker into one of them, and gets dragged away screaming. Everyone is returned to normal, and Picard says it's just time to get on with the day as if nothing happened. So this is an episode which I generally quite fondly remember as far as season 1 episodes go, but upon reviewing it with a more critical eye, I found myself realising it's really quite a mixed bag of an episode. It's not a terrible episode, but it is messy and it just meanders about aimlessly for far too long before getting to the actual meat of the episode. And when we do get there, it just feels rushed, and I wasn't entirely sure what point it was trying to get across. Is it trying to say that having godlike powers is bad? Having gifts from your friend with godlike powers is bad? Or was it just trying to say that power corrupts and humanity still isn't ready for that kind of power? Also, what was Q really trying to prove or accomplish in the end? This had the potential, I think, to be a really good episode. I mean, the ingredients are there with good concepts and ideas, but as is all too common with season 1, it's poorly implemented. If the intention was to show how having such powers in the hands of a human can corrupt, then it shouldn't have waited until the last 10 minutes to try and finally have that debate. The first 20 minutes which lead up to giving Riker the powers of the Q could have just easily been streamlined into the first 5 minutes instead. So, just as an idea, the Enterprise is on its way to save some people from a catastrophe when Q stops them dead and takes Riker off the bridge, leaving everyone else to wonder what's going on. Meanwhile, Q puts Riker through a game or two just to make him realise the power he now has and then sends him back to the ship. Q doesn't necessarily need to explain his motivations at this point, just hint at them. Riker can explain to Picard what happened, and Picard can still tell him that he shouldn't use his powers because humanity isn't ready for them. Then you can spend the rest of the episode playing things out normally and putting obstacles in Riker's path which will slowly erode his will and tempt him into using those powers until eventually he starts giving in and losing himself in his growing arrogance before Picard finally snaps him out of it and rejecting what Q was trying to offer in the first place. And then maybe you can have a good debate between Picard and Q on the nature of existence and power and how the potential of humanity is something that Q fear in the long run before Q gets pulled back by the Continuum for failing to tempt Riker. To me at least, this sounds like a much better episode if it had played out this way, or something similar. As much as I enjoy John Delancey's performance as Q, and it is good fun, they should have just cut out all the crap with the awfully designed animal soldiers and the crew trying to figure out what to do about them, streamline those early conversations and Q doing his tricks, and focus on the meat of Riker trying to struggle with his newfound powers. Once again, and this is a familiar theme now, I'm reminded of a TOS episode, Where No Man Has Gone Before, which was actually the second pilot episode of TOS after The Cage and first introduced us to Kirk. In that episode, you had a chap called Gary Mitchell who is one of Kirk's oldest friends. He ends up with godlike powers after some shenanigans, but rather than going straight from normal to super arrogant and dangerous, is slowly built up over the course of the episode to be a dangerous threat as he goes beyond everyone else's ability to control. I feel this example is how they should have generally treated Riker, though he doesn't necessarily need to have become a dangerous threat to the rest of the crew, but you could still show that slow progression from his normal self into something else, trying to bestow gifts upon his friends before Picard finally snaps him back to reality. Instead though, we just get a single scene with a dead girl to make Riker feel bad about making his promise to Picard, as he could have used his powers to save her, and then he just flips from agreeing the powers are not a good idea to immediately becoming an arrogant dick, referring to Picard on a first name basis and just generally acting like he owns the place. As for those last 10 minutes, it ultimately falls flat because it didn't take the time to properly build up to it. Instead, we just get a few minutes of Riker trying to give people the gifts they always wanted, only for them to end up rejecting him for, reasons. I suppose it was the episode's way of trying to say that, humanity had moved on to a point where they realised the price for accepting miracle-like gifts from godlike beings, inherently implying that it's bad, I guess? I suppose I can sort of get where most of the crew are coming from. Geordi, for example, has an incredible gift with his visor and being able to see things no other human could, though at the expense of having any normal vision and living with constant pain as a result. Data tries to imply it wouldn't feel real to him if he were made human, but how would he know until he feels it? I guess for him it's more about the journey, about learning to be more human than simply becoming human at the snap of someone's fingers. Wesley too, okay, yeah, as kids, sometimes we want to be adults already, but all I could think of was just how you just stole 10 years of Wesley's life away. Also, why was Wesley even there in the first place? There's really no reason for him to be on the bridge at this moment, but I suppose he's a main character, so we've got to have him there somehow. As for Worf's reason though, that whole thing just felt dumb. Are we suggesting all Worf needs is a sex slave to be happy? And as for poor Yar and Crusher, they didn't even get a turn, because fuck them, I guess. After all this though, Riker suddenly realises, yep, I've been a dick, I shouldn't have these powers, and then everyone turns on Q, who then gets dragged away by the Continuum. End of episode. As I said, it's a rushed mess. Speaking of Yar quickly though, she actually gets a little bit to do in this episode, by being made useless ironically. Her characterization though, or what little we've ever had of it so far, is all over the place here. I can understand that as a supposed tough chief of security type character, being in charge and having control of a situation is her shtick, and to have that taken away from her is of course going to be incredibly frustrating for such a character. But her breaking down crying felt cheap and not something she would believably do. It would have made much more sense for her to simply be more angry and just lash out more aggressively at being forced into such a situation beyond her control. And when she briefly appears to flirt with Picard, I'm just left thinking, what the fuck? First she's crying and then she's coming on to Picard? Some digging into the background behind the scenes though shows that because Troy was cut from this episode, many of her lines were actually transferred to Yar, which may explain this odd moment and would make much more sense as Troy is a more emotional person. But this certainly does no favours to Yar's character. Despite me shitting all over this episode, I still want to emphasise that I do generally enjoy good portions of it just because of Q himself. As with the encounter at Farpoint, he saves the episode from being a terrible one simply because he's just such a joy to watch on the screen whenever he's on. He's a bit more wacky here than in Farpoint, but there's also some good scenes where he briefly touches on the nature of the universe with Riker and hints at what the Q are and how humanity have the potential to grow perhaps even beyond the Q in the eons to come. Picard and Q also has some good scenes together, their back and forths coming across a bit more fluidly than in Farpoint, but still not quite to the level of their future interactions. So yeah, as much as I want to really like this episode, just because I usually enjoy episodes with Q in them, my critical analysis must admit that in reality this episode is just not nearly as good as I remembered, though I still think it's worth watching if only to enjoy John Delancey's performance as Q. Next time, Councillor Troy gets married off, there's a crisis involving some diseased aliens, and Luoxana Troy. Yeah, looking forward to that one. Do feel free to leave comments or feedback, and if you enjoyed this episode then please do like, subscribe and share. This is Jay Warden, signing off.